It's not the first time the Libyan leader has suggested solving the crisis through talks. Now, scared of a full-scale U.S. offensive, the colonel had tried to reach out to Washington early on, offering negotiations. He's done that in the past. Now, why have all his efforts or his offers for talks been ignored or rejected, do you think?
Well, the reason his offers have been rejected is the same reason as the NATO countries decided to intervene in Libya in the first place. And to understand why they did that, we have to understand that this war is fundamentally a war to maintain Africa in its subordinate position in the global economy. What's been happening, and this all has to be seen in the context of the rise of China as well. China in the last 5 years has been investing massively in Africa in a way that's unprecedented in terms of building infrastructure and manufacturing industry. Now, this threatens the whole for the Western ascribed role for Africa, for the Western financial institutions and corporations, is as a provider of cheap labor, in fact often slave labor, and raw materials. Now, what Chinese manufacturing investment is going to do is potentially allow Africa to export finished products rather than having to constantly export cheap raw materials. Now, how has the US decided to deal with this? In the only way it knows how, militarily. So it set up a couple of years back Africon, African Command and Control Center for Africa, but no African country wanted to host it. US doesn't have any base at all in Africa. It's negotiating one with Djibouti, and that's it. And part of the reason for this is that in 2010, Gaddafi made a proposal to the African Union that was adopted, that no African country would allow a US base on its soil. So the US has been, since that time, the US has been desperate to get rid of Gaddafi and foist onto Libya their own people, effectively.
Yeah, Mr. Gaisberg, it's interesting you're talking about the changing landscape of Africa, the role of that. I would like to get into that a bit later on. But just to clarify what you're saying, is that the reason you're saying that the rebels themselves don't want to sit down and talk? It's because of this changing of landscape? I mean, just from the rebels' point of view, why don't they want to sit down and talk to Gaddafi?
Well, don't forget, when we talk about the rebels, this is a very disparate group of people. Really, who's calling the shots is NATO. The TNC, who's calls themselves the rebel leadership, although actually they don't really have control even of their own troops. They issue edicts one day that rebels should refrain from looting houses, refrain from shooting into civilian houses, refrain from summarily executing black Africans, and the soldiers just ignore it. At the same time, the soldiers themselves have no respect for the TNC leadership. So when we're talking about the rebels, we have to understand, well, the rebels are a very disparate group. We don't really know what all of them want. And who's really calling the shots is NATO. And the few leaders that we hear about, Mahmoud Jibril, Abdul Jalil, these are people who have established links with Western financial institutions going back over several years. So really, when we hear from these people, they're the mouthpieces of NATO. As for the rest of the rebels, we don't know what they want, frankly.
Oh, okay. Speaking about what's going to happen, you're saying they don't know what they want, the rebels. So let's look a little bit forward. Many predict that another civil war ahead for Libya is coming. You have different factions possibly will argue and fight among themselves. Now, what could the scenario lead to? I mean, how do you expect NATO to act given that this is a possibility for Libya?
Well, let's look at, we have to go by historical precedent here rather than wishful thinking. Let's look at NATO's previous interventions in the last 10 years. Let's look at Kosovo, look at Afghanistan, look at Iraq. What you see here is that there's been a lot of talk about, well, what will happen? Will there be Sharia law? Will there be a liberal democracy? What we have to understand is that what will replace the Libyan state won't be any of those things. What will replace the Libyan state will be the same as what's replaced the state in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is a dysfunctional government, complete lack of security, gang warfare and civil war. And this is not a mistake from NATO. They would prefer to see failed states than states that are powerful and independent and able to challenge their hegemony. And those who are fighting for NATO in Libya and fighting for the TNC really need to understand that this is NATO's vision for their country. They need to wake up and see that they're being used here.
All right, Mr. Glaber, we're running out of time, but I do want to ask you this. I mean, London has been at the forefront of this campaign. How profitable will these new deals we're talking about be for the UK?
Are profitable for the UK?
Yes.
Well, that's an interesting question. Financial Times in 2009 warned that Gaddafi was succumbing to a virulent brand of resource nationalism, they said, meaning that he was negotiating hard with the oil companies, the Western oil companies, for a better deal for Libya. So presumably, and Jibril has just been speaking in the last couple of days, saying that the NATO countries and those countries that helped to topple Gaddafi will get special privileges when it comes to dividing out Libya's resources. So presumably the UK oil companies will do very well. The role of BP has been absolutely crucial in all of this. Mark Allen, the head of BP who negotiated BP's deal in 2007, was a former MI6 officer who got special clearance from the Cabinet Office, fast-tracked to go out of MI6 and into BP, didn't have to go through the normal vetting procedures, was fast-tracked into BP to negotiate this oil deal. And it seems that a lot of the movement around that time within Gaddafi's government may have been part of BP's deal. That was when Jibril got his job in Gaddafi's government. That was when Abdul Jalil got his job. So the oil companies have been crucial in all of this, and presumably they'll be rewarded by the rebel government.
All right. Thank you very much. We've run out of time, but thank you very much for your thoughts. Dan Glaber, political analyst on the Middle East. Thank you.